Welcome. I'm Betsy Atkins. I'm a serial entrepreneur and a three-time CEO, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. We're going to be talking about Web3 and digital assets and the emergence of this new trend. As with every trend, we ask ourselves three questions. Is this an opportunity? Is it a risk? Or is it a distraction? If we go back to the 1990s, we had Web 1 with the use case of email and catalogs. And we asked ourselves then, is this going to be an opportunity for our business, or is it a risk, or is it a distraction? Then in the early 2000s, we had ubiquitous cellular everywhere. And we had this question of the new trend, mobile first. And again, same questions. Is this a risk, an opportunity, or a distraction? In 2010s, we had the king platforms of Amazon and Google and Facebook. And again, the emergence of e-commerce with these dominant platforms. And the question was, is it an opportunity? Is it a risk for our business or a distraction? Well, now we have had three data points of Web 1, Web 2, mobile first, and e-commerce. And what we've learned is the companies that leaned in became the leaders and became more valuable. And those that didn't got left behind. So now as we think about Web 3 and digital assets, we think about Bitcoin, stablecoin, NFTs, and some of those use cases, and then even more complicated parts of Web 3, blockchain, the metaverse where you can own virtual real estate, and even taking control of your own digital identity and having privacy and deciding if you want to monetize your identity or not. These are complex things, but our goal today is to become more conversant and more comfortable and a little bit more knowledgeable so that we can assess which of these things make sense, which elements and use cases are a good fit for our company. While this might not be important to you personally, it certainly has to be important to you as a director. The reason is a very big part of our population, of our millennial and Gen Z cohort of 44%, they do care about Web3 and digital assets. And they're our customers, they're our employees, and our investors. When we think about millennials, we think about born native. And then when we think about Gen Z, we think about them born crypto. Well, the generation after that is Gen Alpha. And I actually think they're going to be born metaverse. And the one thing that we know is it's our job as directors to anticipate this fast velocity of change. It took Amazon 24 years to have a market cap of 1 trillion. It only took Bitcoin 12 years to have a market cap of 1 trillion. And if we look at the public companies today, half of the public companies, 50%, are gone in 10 years. They're no longer independent public companies. So our role as directors is to anticipate risk and to future-proof our companies. And to help us with that, I'm so pleased to introduce Jenny Johnson. Jenny is the CEO of Franklin Templeton. She's an entrepreneur, she's an entrepreneur, she's an innovator and a pioneer. So without any further ado, Jenny, welcome.
Thanks, Betsy. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's great to be with you. I'm hoping you'll share with us, Franklin Templeton is a very innovative company and very entrepreneurial. Will you share your thinking about these new asset classes, Bitcoin, stablecoin, NFTs?
Sure. What I would say, and I hadn't heard you describe it until now, but this question of new technologies, is it an opportunity? Is it a risk? Or is it a distraction? And the answer in this case, I think, is, yeah, it's all three. And I think as directors, I think certainly as a CEO of a public company, we have to understand where technology is evolving and how it can disrupt traditional business models. Obviously, Franklin Templeton, as an asset manager with assets of 1.5 trillion, we have to understand where disruption can impact any industry, not just our own. And so I look at blockchain, and what I tend to say to people is it is the greatest disruption probably in my 33 plus years in the industry that I've seen, but also can be the greatest distraction. So I think there's opportunities. I think there's risks if you don't pay attention. And I certainly think you can end up down a lot of rabbit holes with distraction.
Tell me, philosophically, I think you're a really unique company that you lean into innovation. Will you share a little bit about, why you do and how important you think technology is in general before we ask you a little bit more about your own approach to Web3?
Sure. So I'm third generation at Franklin Templeton. The company was started by my grandfather as Franklin Funds. My father took it over when it was $2.5 million in assets and I think 10,000 in revenue. So he's the one who really, really built it. My brother was CEO for 15 years and now I'm CEO. And I say, the family still has something like 43% or family and management personnel, 43% ownership of the company, even though it's a public company. And I think that gives us the ability to think longer terms. I think about, okay, am I positioning this business for the fourth and fifth generation? And I think that one of the challenges with public company CEO don't have that kind of internal ownership is there's a lot of pressure on quarterly earnings. And what have you done in the last 3 years? And sometimes some of these technology disruptions, it's the hockey stick, right? You kind of buzz along, bouncing along at the low end, and then suddenly it takes off, and everybody wonders why it was an overnight success. And yet, those who've been involved say, "Are you kidding me?" And it's been a drag for a long time. So when you think in terms of multiple generations, you have to think in terms of not only maintaining and running the business for growth in the short run, but also where are you making bets and reasonable bets for long term that you think could be disruptive.
I love that philosophy. And obviously it's been working, right? The company's doing phenomenally. Share a little bit, if you will, your philosophy, how you're thinking about Web3 and digital assets with us.
So I think somebody described it pretty well to me, was sort of like Web 1 was, think of it like a billboard, right? I mean, for those who are old enough to remember when the internet first came out, you thought about it as a company like, I got to put up a cool billboard. And you weren't thinking about it as a communication channel. And then Web 2.0 became a communication channel, transactions, back and forth information. Web 3.0, think of it as, so people describe one as read it, Web 2 was write it, and number 3 is own it. And the reason it's significant is the technology is enabling kind of a changing business model where tokenization allows you to own part of it, not only be a client, but also be an owner. And I'll give an example, of why traditional businesses have to, and directors of companies of traditional businesses have to be aware of this. So think about Google today. Anytime you do a search, they capture 100% of the economic value that you bring to that search engine. Well, there's a company, I think it's poorly executed. Actually, there's multiple ones now doing this, where when you search, they're able to pay you in their tokens, and they may be some form of an Ethereum token, say. And so you're going to capture some percentage of your economic value. So you're almost like an equity owner. As the network grows, as the value of the company grows, because you're contributing, you're actually getting paid to that. So you're a client and you capture some of the economic value. And that's what people mean by sort of this ownership. And there's so many ways in which this is evolving that I think it's pretty fascinating. I think every company has to understand how somebody could potentially come in and disrupt their traditional model.
That raises such a perfect question about what are the drivers of Web3 and digital assets. Is it going to be that I can own my own digital identity and I decide if I want to monetize my brand, and I decide if I want to be private? and I can earn tokens for wearing a designer's sneaker in the metaverse, for example, to promote it or not. Do you think that's the driver? Do you think it's the unique, protocol attributes of the blockchain? Which are, is it the fact that I get portability with my Bitcoin? What do you see as the drivers and the influencers?
So I think the drivers have been developing over decades, which is things like cloud computing, the algorithms, the cryptology involved in blockchain. The ability from this massive amount of data to be analyzed, and unstructured data such as video to be analyzed. All those things are the confluence of them are bringing together opportunities. And what I think you're starting to see is now the application of those opportunities. And it's things like the metaverse is one application of those opportunities. And yes, the answer is I was not one to really engage. I sort of view it as a generational thing on the metaverse. And finally, I started to realize I better not, I got to start paying attention. Enough time and money being generated here, better understand it. So literally assigned it to some college to come back and educate the executive team on the metaverse. And, starting to look at it and say, well, should we buy real estate? So that's one execution of it. But as the confluence of all these different technologies come together, have things, and this is where I say that Bitcoin is the greatest distraction from the greatest disruption in financial services. And that is not to say that I think Bitcoin is worth a zero. People interpret it that way. I think Bitcoin is more like art, and I think there are compelling reasons why people will see value in it. But I think what's more interesting in the blockchain are things like the platforms like Ethereum, Solana, Cardano, where those are, think of them like when the iPhone first came out. We looked at it and said, oh, that's pretty interesting. I've got a camera and a phone and music and a flashlight and GPS. This is all great. What Apple understood was they were unlocking the creativity of the masses by creating this iOS that people can leverage all these great technology to bring unique kinds of businesses like Uber, Airbnb. So think about Uber and Airbnb. What did it do? It allowed each of us to unlock value in assets that we own and be able to create a revenue stream. So Web 3.0, I think, just takes that to a whole other level. You're seeing things, and they existed, but a little bit in a clunky way. There are things like there's a company that allows, when they want to be the fastest streaming service, to compete with a Netflix. And so, when you're watching their content on your device, you're agreeing to let them cache some of their content on your device so that when somebody near them wants to then watch it, it only has to jump from your device to their device. And they pay you in their particular coin, which I think is an Ethereum coin. And they're built on a platform like an Ethereum platform. And so in that, you are now a client. You're also an equity owner. Essentially, you're getting paid as they grow their network, and you're part of their infrastructure. They can buy less AWS cloud because their clients are bringing them infrastructure. Another company that allows you to essentially lease out some of your Wi-Fi, and they have a 2-year waiting list. So they want to build a global kind of Wi-Fi network. Well, if all the individual homes allow a little piece of it to be leveraged on this global network, then and they pay you for that, you could see how it takes that kind of Uber Airbnb model to a whole other level. And it's just the technology, the security, the ability to have these kind of tokens that will have an economic value that I think unlock this sort of new opportunity. But honestly, Betsy, I don't know that anybody knows exactly what this looks like, which is why it's tough, because you don't know who the winners and the losers are going to be. Just like, frankly, when Web 2.0 came out, we didn't really know who the winners and losers.
But it's interesting to hear you talk about the use cases, right? Where we as individuals conceptually are a node on the network and we become part of the infrastructure. we get compensated and can monetize our engagement with a token. And additionally, we're in control of our brand, of our identity, of our privacy, and it's our decision, which is not so now. And that's
right.
a pretty big difference. When you think about how you'd characterize the blockchain, because, in layman terms, you've done the homework, you've come up the learning curve. Share how, you think about, describing for us the blockchain and what you think are, some example use cases to make it come alive.
So I think of it as simply really sophisticated cryptology that brings together a transaction that is secure. And so it's technology. So what happens when a transaction is secure? Today, we pay a lot of third parties to validate that two people coming in on a transaction are legitimate. You pay a title company to ensure this person legitimately has ownership of the asset, the residence they're selling you. You put money in an escrow account to ensure that the money is going to be there. Those are all, I call them toll takers. They're all toll takers in a transaction, and they increase the cost of a transaction. But if you can, one, ensure because of this cryptology in it, and that you have these called node validators, you have these third parties that are validating that the transaction is legitimate. We'll talk about why that's important from a cybersecurity standpoint. And you can actually build in, quote unquote, the legal terms in smart contracts. So when the title transfers, I know that the transaction releases the funds from the escrow account. Like all of those can be built into an individual token. So if you can take all of those costs and squeeze out a bunch of the costs, you can start to fractionalize ownership in different ways. So think about if you own the Empire State Building, you're a real estate development company, you own the Empire State Building, and you think, well, I think if I could sell it to 1 million people versus another real estate development or a REIT, I'd make more money. I'd probably get a premium for unlocking this value. And the reason those types of things will be able to happen is in that individual token, I can own 1 millionth of the Empire State Building. I can get the rent paid to me through the smart contract that automatically goes into my checking account. And I can sell it to you, Betsy. And you know that if you have that token, it is really secure and it's legit. So that'll enable, these illiquid assets to become democratized for people. They can actually start to participate because again, you're driving up the cost. And then this whole node validation. So, as a financial services firm, believe me, we spend a lot of money on cybersecurity. Well, the nice thing about validating the distributed nature of the ledger for transactions blockchain is such that Franklin Templeton is a node validator for some different platforms. It's the revenue stream that we get. So as a node validator, we have built our own infrastructure. Now, there might be 9 or 10 or 20 other validators on that same platform that have their own infrastructure that's independent. So if a bad actor comes in and breaches one of us, the good news is, one is they're not going to know who the 19 other ones are. And two, they're going to have a different architecture. So it becomes they don't have the same vulnerabilities. And so that the transactions, as long as 51% of the validators say it's legit, then the transaction becomes legitimate. And that's better from a cybersecurity.
Incredibly better. But quick question. Talk about blockchain and, KYC, anti-money laundering, AML. Those are parts of doing a transaction. And in the financial services, of course, you live with that. Talk about a big toll being taken.
Yes.
Talk about how that relates to the blockchain.
So it's kind of funny because you often get people who will say, well, the blockchain is all about, Bitcoin, and the blockchain is all about the dark web and the nefarious transactions. Well, it's actually precisely the opposite. Ultimately, and it's one of the reasons I think you see China coming out with their digital yuan, is that the truth is, once an actor makes a transaction on the chain, it never goes away. You can track it. The reason it was initially tied to bad actors is when you have to hold your tokens in a wallet, so they call it a crypto wallet or a digital wallet. Initially, those wallets were created and you didn't have to validate who you are. But nowadays, if you go on any of the large exchanges and you want to go open an account on the exchange and hold a wallet, you have to go through a KYC AML process. And I think as the regulation evolves, really going to be mandated. So once you're valid as far as a KYC and AML, you can't go on Coinbase without or Gemini or any of these without actually going through the same process you go through to open a bank account. Any transactions and tokens in there are absolutely tied to you, and they are there forever. So from a taxing authority and from a regulation standpoint, you're going to see that actually regulators and the IRS are going to love this as a means of transactions, because it's going to be much harder to avoid paying any taxes on a transaction permanently registered.
So conceptually, when you think about blockchain and we think about the legacy systems we currently use, blockchain is going to encompass the same level of security of know your customer, anti-money laundering. And so we can feel good about that. You mentioned the challenging word, the regulators. So we have two big regulators who are in an arm wrestle about who will be the regulator in charge. We have the SEC, and then we have the CFTC, the Commodities Future Exchange. And they're debating if these digital assets, whether they're a security or whether they're a commodity. If it's a commodity, it's the CFTC, the Futures Commodity Exchange. If it's a security, it's the SEC. So where do you think that'll end up? And share your views on the regulatory debates going on.
So a couple of things. So actually, Franklin Templeton has we worked with the SEC. The SEC was very engaged on a tokenized money market fund. And, it was one of these processes where we took a traditional type of asset and tokenized it. And so they were able to kind of get their arms around that. And both the CFTC and the SEC are very engaged. The challenge is, pretty analogy to me, and I thought it was great, is we have invented flying cars and we're trying to use the same rules as driving a streetcar around. And the problem is, as we've talked about, nobody really knows where this goes. So there's a real fear that if you start to impose rules for flying cars, well, maybe you really didn't understand what it was and they don't apply. And so that's where I think you're seeing this hesitation of clarity, which I think frustrates a lot of the entrepreneurs in the space. I do think it is important that the U.S. figures this out. I say the U.S. between the SEC and the CFTC, because seeing other jurisdictions providing more clarity around regulation. And when that happens, entrepreneurs go to those jurisdictions and set up. And you don't want to lose out to those other opportunities. So I think regulatory clarity is really important, but it's very complicated. I don't envy the regulators who are trying to figure out how to step up and do this.
It's an interesting time. I was speaking with some of the big exchanges, Coinbase, Binance, FTX, and their view is that the commodities future regulator, the CFTC, has a much higher level of sophistication and they understand things better than the SEC, which is sort of rule enforcers with a giant amount of lawyers, but they're not as creative at thinking things through. If you were going to give a recommendation to the regulators, what would it be? Hurry up, we're late?
Well, I think the SEC chairman actually taught blockchain courses at MIT. So I doubt that there's a lack of understanding on Chancellor's part as far as sophistication. I think there's a real understanding that this is complicated stuff. Many of the traditional, our tokenized money market fund was literally taking a money market fund and expressing the shareholder records in a token, a blockchain token. But many of these kind of ETFs and I think most of them are ETFs, but closed-end funds and things are using derivatives
Right.
which fall under the CFTC.
It's the derivatives.
Right, because they can't get the underlying asset because it's not a legitimate security yet. So I think that's why people would say, oh, well, the CFTC maybe understands it better. But I think that's merely because that was a creative way of trying to sort of get exposure to traditional asset. But I'm not sure I'm not sure one understands it better than the others. Both that just complicated stuff.
So you mentioned ETFs. Where are you in your views on Bitcoin ETFs, crypto ETFs, Web3? How do you think about it? You think it's going to grow? What are you seeing?
I actually think whether you call it an ETF or a traditional fund, closed-end fund or open-end 40 Act fund, I actually think ultimately traditional investments pooled investment vehicles will be expressed leveraging blockchain tokens. I think that the democratization of the private markets is going to be fueled by blockchain technology and tokenization. And so I don't think it's either or. Now, having said that, I have to make this point, which is if you're going to invest in this space, Bitcoin, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, is attempting to be kind of a global currency. Think of it as that. And there are a lot of compelling reasons. I've had friends who are pro-Bitcoin who, from Israel and said, hey, my family had multiple generations of money taken away from governments. They will always allocate this, have it outside. So I get that. And so that's why I say I think there's compelling reasons on either side of that. The much more interesting investment opportunity, and like Franklin's come out, we have 5, I think, different strategies. Some of them are more like almost a passive, where it's like the top 20 coins or the top 20 coins, excluding Bitcoin and Ethereum, or equal weighting them because there's those are so much bigger than all the rest. Is a better way to approach that market or this market because there is tremendous innovation coming. And until Bitcoin and Ethereum no longer trade in step, where it's just a risk on, risk off transaction, you can assume that this is not a mature market. You have to start seeing differentiation in the underlying investment to know that really people are starting to understand the space better. And we're just like when you had, people talk about this crypto winter, just like when you had the .com blow up. I mean, you still had amazing companies that came out of that. Google, Amazon. I mean, there were so many, Airbnb. All of those came out of the dust because there's always a lot of hype when there's technology. And in that hype, there's a lot of companies that are funded that probably don't make it through those crypto winters. But that's why I think from an investment standpoint, you want to allocate. I don't think it's a big number, but a small number, and you want it to be diversified because it's still such early days, and we don't yet know who the winners and losers.
So we shouldn't give up hope. We're going to come through the winter, and it's going to revive because it's an important macro trend, and it's not going to stop.
Well, and the other thing we haven't talked about here is the kind of social network that you're starting to see people create, which is really interesting. You see sports teams. I mean, forget the social component of this for a second, but just the NBA in one quarter generated $500 million in revenue by selling off little video clips in NFTs, where you get to own the little clip. I mean, that's whole new. That's like found money. One of the I can't remember, one of the fashion houses, I think it was Gucci, came out with their new fall line and did a video clip and sold it for $25,000 so that you get to own their fall line clip. You're seeing people take physical assets and the metaverse, and I think it's called physitization or something like that, and they bring them together so your character in the metaverse can try on this dress that this new fashion house has come up with, trying to bring these things together, and so you start to see it where it's leading into kind of the social component. Sports teams are, I mean, you could take a baseball team and sell off 1% of ownership to 100,000 people, and basically they get bragging rights with their token, but maybe they get a special coaches session after the game that 100,000 people join. Maybe they get the best upgrades to see tickets, whatever. It's a loyalty program that's tied to economic value. So we have a company that's in our incubator. Franklin Templeton has an incubator that is helping artists leverage Web 3.0, capture a greater percentage of the revenues associated with their art. So this company, Lobus, they'll help an artist build kind of their web presence. And when they sell a painting today, an artist sells a painting, they capture about a third of the first sale. In this case, they tie an NFT to that painting. And when they sell it, the smart contract ensures that they get paid their 1/3. But now when that person sells it in the secondary market and the NFT goes with it, that smart contract gives some revenue back to the original artist. That artist can have sessions for their fans, but only those who own a piece of art and can prove it with their NFT can attend that. Louis Vuitton is tied NFTs to chips in their purses to ensure that when you have one, it is absolutely a valid Louis Vuitton purse. So this crossing of physical and virtual, I think, is where it gets really, really interesting.
I think that's so true. And we saw it start in the gaming industry, right? Roblox, Epic, they were the early people who, brought this gamification, which as a theme in business, we gamify how we learn, how we, take our internal training courses. And this virtual merchandise came from them. And you see it a lot in consumer. You see it, as you say, in sports. You see it in fashion, in retail. I thought that it was very interesting. SAP did a actual NFT for a certification that you were at a certain level. And so it would go on your LinkedIn and you would have a permanent record to be able to prove that you had been certified at a certain level in a particular software language, which I thought was very interesting, because the obvious thing is to think of it in consumer, but it's in business too.
For sure. And just imagine, that from a reference checking, if you knew that you could completely rely that this candidate has these certifications, how much easier that would be. Take it, the smart contract, there's actually a company in China who, and I don't know the name of the company, but let's just say it were Apple. It's not, but for all of us, we can understand the concept. Let's say Apple is out there and they say, all right, I'm going to build iPads. So I'm going to hire this manufacturer who's going to supply, some of the material. And then that manufacturer needs to go, they're going to supply the glass, but that manufacturer needs to go to another manufacturer to actually get the individual lenses, say for the iPhone. And now this little manufacturer suddenly has all these volumes that it wasn't expecting. They need to go get a loan. Well, they don't have really great credit. They haven't been that big. And so they pay a big premium for that loan. But what's happened is the original company, so in this case, let's say it's Apple, is actually building a smart contract with the token all the way down. So now when the bank lends, they can actually write it as if you're underwriting Apple, because they can see through all the contractual terms of the contract to hire for that, right? So it lowers the cost of manufacturing that, which ultimately should translate into lower costs for everybody, the consumer. So it's those types of things that I think get really interesting when you have confidence in the validity of the information.
So that's a perfect example of a business to business use case using the blockchain as a way to take out the middleman and drive faster ability to get a loan, for example, in yours. I think the other thing you said that is very important, that be valuable for our audience, is this notion that NFTs is really important for branding. And I wrote a thought piece that we're giving out that gives the top 10 NFT drops, and you'll be amazed what they are. And the obvious ones of, Coach and Gucci and Nike, but the going from the virtual merchandise to unique physical merchandise is a really important way of driving brand loyalty. And this idea that we talked about earlier, where you can monetize your persona in the metaverse to wear the cool sneakers and then earn tokens. It's pretty interesting. So let me ask you, going forward now, how are you continuing to get the learning and the innovation inside Franklin Templeton so our listeners can think about different organizations? Did you put it in an innovation team, an R&D? How are you getting the learning curve propagated?
So I just did a reorganization a few months ago, and I actually have the head of digital assets reporting directly to me. So I'm quite engaged uh, topic. I think I'm fortunate as a CEO who ran technology, so I have a decent understanding of technology. So it's a comfort for me. But we're doing, one is we launched this money market fund. We built it on the Stellar Network. We worked with the SEC. Now we know kind of how to do that with our traditional products. I mentioned that we're a node validator. So we literally for multiple platforms, we go in and we validate transactions. That teaches us a lot. We have a venture capital fund, and that was really important because if you are known as a venture capital fund, then you see new business cases get presented to you. So suddenly they start coming to you, which is what we're really interested in, is understanding how this is evolving. So we have a venture capital fund, and then I mentioned we have traditional coins. So the VC fund is sort of, I always call it, once you've been listed on a Coinbase or FTX or Binance or Gemini, you've sort of gone IPO. So the venture fund is pre that. And then we also have traditional listed token strategies for those who, are not comfortable, because venture, you're going to have more losers than winners. So for a traditional financial advisor who has clients who want to be able to have some exposure, this gives us really diversified exposure to the digital asset space. And we took traditional Franklin Templeton investment folks who really understood technology and put them in this space. So if you look at like the research report done on, say, Ethereum, it is as sophisticated as a research report that's done on IBM, and trying to, understand and really trying to professionalize kind of the investment approach there. We also have an incubator. We run blockchain contests, multiple universities, where we're just trying to see what students kind of come up with, make sure you're staying in understanding sort of the metaverse and understanding blockchain and understanding how that group's thinking. So we do a lot of different things that are just making sure that we're staying on top of kind of the information flow.
It's very interesting to hear you say this, that because our whole audience will remember, 10, 15 years ago when we started talking about digital transformation. And it didn't work when the chief digital officer was buried in the organization. It had to report to the CEO, or it just was never going, all the money would go to the systems of record in the back office and you'd starve the digital transformation. So it's very informative for everybody to hear that you have the head of digital assets reporting to you. And I also think, we look back at profiles of CEOs because as directors, we think about succession planning. And in the past, if you go back, we picked a new CEO who had a financial background or a product background or a marketing background. Well, if you truly believe that things are going to change and the companies that win are the ones that lean into tech, getting a CEO who has your background, Jenny, of technology, otherwise the organization is just never going to really embrace it. So I think you gave us a lot of tips there.
Well, and whether it's the CEO or somebody on the CEO's team, one of the things, we were talking about a return to office and had a committee together looking at the future of work. And I said, how many people on that committee watch sci-fi? right? Like if you don't have a couple people you listen, not everybody can be all about what things are going to look like in 30, 50 years or 100 years. But you need to have enough people with that curious mind that, sort of embrace sci-fi to think about how things can just have a different angle in how they look at it. So again, I think whether it's the CEO or whether it's somebody on the CEO's team, you have to have some amount of curiosity and creativity around what tech.
I love that. I can't believe the time has flown by. I have to ask you two quick things, if I may, in conclusion. The first one is, so what are you reading and whose podcast are you listening to? Since I want to know some cool sci-fi books. Come on.
Okay, so I'm laughing because I'm actually reading like a totally old school book that by Walter Isaacson on the House of Morgan. So sorry, it's like the history of Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan, really, because they kind of came from the House of Morgan. And I'm looking up because I have this great new podcast on crypto, and I can't remember. Once
Is
it
it
gets
Tim Ferriss?
No, it is. Can't remember it. It's new for me, and it's just been interesting. I asked a well-respected VC, tell me what you listen to, and it's a woman actually. Her name's Lynn something, but I can't.
We'll get it and share it with everybody afterwards. But
Okay.
One last question, if you would, for us. So, what are the learnable kind of recommendations?
First of all, this is really hard. And one of the hardest things about what I think about this, and I was on a panel with some Coinbase folks, and at one point I looked at the guy when we were doing the prep, and I said, dude, you got to land the plane. They have no idea what you're talking about when you start going into all these tech layers. Rick Edelman wrote a book, The Truth About Crypto, which I think is the best description of like how to read, and he just simplifies it in such a great way. So I would say that's a good place to start. And then honestly, you have to kind of dabble in it. Ask yourself, how are you thinking about it? What does it mean? Because there's a part of this that is just basic blocking and tackling back office type stuff that is going to be cheaper if you leverage blockchain. So what are we doing there? Is there any way that this could disrupt our business model? And asking those questions. But again, this is a longer term journey. There's going to be way more failures than successes in it. I just think you have to keep your eye on it.
Jenny, thank you so much for the incredible insight and wisdom. It's really been fabulous having you today. So now, as we think back, with every macro trend, they've all become realities. Web 1, Web 2, mobile first, e-commerce, they all went mainstream. And remember when you asked yourself, is video going to become important? Am I really going to use it? And is mobile first going to be how I actually work? Well, I use YouTube and video all the time, couldn't live without it. And I do all my work on my cell phone, mobile first. So I think the same will happen with Web3 and digital assets. The exact use cases will emerge for blockchain, NFT, stablecoin. We'll build on the foundation of the gaming industry with gamification and virtual merchandise. And it's the exact time for us to think about this. We're entering the final part of the year when we do our annual planning and our strategy for 2023. And it's the moment when we should be asking what parts of Web3 and digital assets might be a fit for our business. And how are our companies going to come up the innovation curve? Each company is unique, and what's appropriate for a business-to-business industrial company obviously isn't the same for a direct-to-consumer born digital e-commerce company. But I think all of us need to be thinking about this. And if we go back to the opening question with every new trend with Web3, is it an opportunity? Is it a risk or a distraction? Well, for me, as a lifelong entrepreneur, it's an opportunity. I know you're going to have some really interesting conversations with your board colleagues and leadership teams on the topic. And I hope it's been a valuable conversation. Thank you for your time. It's been great to be with you. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye now.